Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Brookings. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I am Martin Indyk, the Executive Vice President here at Brookings. We are very honoured to have the opportunity to host the Holbrooke Forum here at Brookings. We've been meeting over the last 2 days. We'll go on in our, as a sign of the seriousness of the commitment of the people involved. They're even going to deliberate tomorrow morning, something that's never happened in Brookings history. But nevertheless, we are indeed honoured. Richard Holbrooke was a good friend of many of us here at Brookings. We've hosted him many times in this room in his various positions that he held in the US government, and hosted him for private deliberations during the time that he was the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he's a personal friend of mine, Strobe Talbot's, and many other Brookings members of the Brookings family. So we were especially glad to have the opportunity to join with the American Academy in Berlin, which was established by Richard Holbrooke, and which is a unique institution that promotes US-German relations by bringing intellectuals, scholars, historians, artists, and public officials to Berlin to engage with their counterparts in Germany. And in Richard Holbrooke's memory, the American Academy established the Holbrooke Forum to promote his particular way of dealing with crises in international affairs. And the Holbrooke method, which we've been discussing, was a very activist one. But it was based on a holistic approach, bringing in experts from every dimension of the problem, and developing practical, actionable solutions to serious problems that had a humanitarian dimension to them. And of course, he's remembered for the great work that he did with the Dayton Accords and the crisis in Bosnia. But as Gary Smith, the founder of the American Academy with Richard Holbrooke, reminded me the other night, Richard regarded migration and the problem of refugees as a burning issue for him. And there is no doubt in my mind that he would have wanted the Holbrooke Forum to be focused on refugees, as we have been over the last 2 days. And we have many experts here from Europe, the United States, and elsewhere that bring their experience with refugees to bear on this critical crisis. This afternoon we have 2 panels. The first is one in which Leon Wieseltier and Michael Ignatieff will discuss the moral and policy implications of the refugee crisis that we face at the moment. But before I bring them up on stage to begin that session, which will be followed by another session that focuses on the policy implications, we wanted to show you a short video. Some of you may have seen it, but it's one that brings home, I think, the human dimension and the human tragedy of this current refugee crisis. So let's look at that for a moment. Thank you. I want to start by saying a special welcome to the Academy's President, Gerhard Casper, to the Academy's Chairman, Gail Burt, and to the Forum co-chairs, Harold Coe, Nada Musavizadeh, and Michael Ignatieff. The forum that I described to you is titled The Global Migration Challenge Crisis, Its Challenges to the United States, Europe, and the Global Order. We wanted to start this discussion today with a conversation between Leon Wieseltier and Michael Ignatieff to place the crisis that was so vividly portrayed in that video in context. Michael Ignatieff, along with Harold Coe and Nada Musavizadeh, has organized the Holbrooke Forum for several years now. He came to my attention because of a great biography he wrote of Isaiah Berlin. During the time that he was a professor at Harvard and director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. After that, he served as a member of Parliament in the Canadian Parliament and then leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and leader of the opposition. Unfortunately, Michael is no longer the leader of the opposition because he would have been Prime Minister of Canada today, but Canada's loss is our gain. Among his other major publications, The Lesser Evil, Political Ethics in an Age of Terror, and his most recent, Fire and Ashes, Success and Failure in Politics. I'm writing a book about success and failure too. I've long admired Michael's intellectual contributions, and it's a real pleasure to have him with us on the stage this afternoon. As it happens, Leon Wieseltier is the Isaiah Berlin Senior Fellow in Culture and Policy at the Brookings Institution. Many of you know Leon very well because of his incredible hair, which I've been trying to emulate, but he's actually known for far more important things. In particular, he was the famous literary editor of the New Republic from 1983 all the way up to 2014. He is the author of several books, including the widely acclaimed Kaddish, which was published in 1998. He's been the Godkin Lecturer at Harvard University and the Gruss Professor in Talmudic Civil Law at Harvard Law School. We are honored and delighted that Leon has joined us here, that the New Republic's loss has been Brookings' gain.
You took in a refugee.
And we discovered how much we can benefit from absorbing refugees. Leon's been working on an essay on refugees, which we will be publishing as a Brookings essay. And I wanted to start by asking him to just give us a kind of detailed synopsis of the argument that he is going to make there.
Thank you, my beloved friend. I've been told I can speak for 20 minutes, and I'll go through some things rather quickly. First, I wanted to say about what we just watched. I would say two things about that, both of which I'm sure I'm not the only one. The feeling is not mine. The first one is that when I see those scenes, I feel shame and anger at the failure of our country and other Western countries in having done anything, not having done anything significant to prevent that. And secondly, and this may sound banal, but it isn't, when I see that footage, I'm reminded again that what we are dealing with here is an emergency. Now, we need to rethink or refresh our sense of what an emergency is. If you understand that this is an emergency, you will understand, firstly, that the discussion of refugees should not be absorbed into the discussion of immigration, because refugees are very particular kind of immigrants. And there's an urgency there that puts them in an entirely different category. And secondly, if you reflect on the fact that it's an emergency, you realize that the discussion of refugees must not be absorbed into the discussion of intervention. Because whether the talks in Vienna get restarted or don't get restarted, whether a political solution in Syria is possible or not, the hundreds of thousands of poor people that we're talking about cannot wait upon the results of any attempt at a political solution. And finally, if you reflect on the fact that we're talking about an emergency, you will come to ponder the question of whether or not the United States government is intellectually and operationally at all prepared any longer for emergency action. The idea of emergency action is something that we have to revisit and think more clearly about, because that is what, there are crises in which it is wise to escalate, but there are other crises in which you don't really understand the problem unless you go in whole at the most urgent point. In my research, well, for this essay, but generally, I've been thinking a lot about this question, and I've recently read, I got a hold of the full folio of the papers from the Avion Conference in 1938. You will recall that the Avion Conference was a conference called by President Roosevelt. 1938 was one of the darkest years in European history. It was the Anschluss in Austria, the question of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, the Munich Agreement, and Kristallnacht. Not a good year. And a great many Austrian and German Jewish refugees were produced, and the president thought there should be a conference because, as a friend of mine here at Brookings many years ago used to say when he read an interesting article in the paper, it was a conference-building measure. So I thought I'd go look at the papers, and I just brought one thing, the letter that Roosevelt sent to Myron Taylor, who was the man he appointed, the former president of U.S. Steel, who was a close friend of his, whom he appointed to be chairman of the American delegation to Avion. He writes and tells him what an honor it is to be appointed to this, and he tells him that, that his task is to expedite and facilitate the immigration of refugees to those countries willing to receive them within the provisions of their existing legislation, period. In other words, the mandate of the emergency conference at Avion was to accept the existing legal and political conditions regarding refugees as given and to learn to work within them, which of course is why the Avion conference was a notorious failure. I'm not going to trouble you with any more of those documents, but I did bring, you have to see it, among the documents from the Avion conference, I found the menu and the wine list. I want you to know that as they were discussing the fate of these refugees, they were eating Borch à la Russe and Le Délice de Sol des Douvres, and the wine was Chateau Latour 1920. I thought, you know, these are the kind of things that come to the fore at moments like this. The panel that follows us will be about policy, which is just as well. Policy, at least of a certain kind, is not what I do. I would like to talk a little bit more about the philosophical and moral and even cultural dimensions of the debate about immigration, about refugees. Sorry, I just committed the sin that I said I shouldn't commit. And I would like to frame this debate so that we can understand conceptually how it is that we're even debating whether or not to honor the rights. And remember, refugees have rights. We haven't discussed that very much, but this is not just a matter of compassion. They have claims upon us because they have rights. How it is that we've arrived at this point in the debate. And I want to discuss it in terms of two themes. The first one are different approaches to human identity, and the second is different approaches to the nation state, because both of them, I believe, are implicated in this very primary fundamental discussion. In the philosophical literature, but generally, even in our culture, there have been two dominant conceptions of human identity. One of them we could call cosmopolitan, and the other communitarian. The cosmopolitan notion of the human person prefers those attributes of the human person that are universal to all people. that are universal to all people. In other words, the features of the person that matter most and make the person morally significant are those features that do not distinguish him from others, but that unite him from others, meaning what we refer to somewhat tritely as common humanity. The idea of common humanity has a history too, but we're not going to go into that. The communitarian conception of the person, by contrast, prefers those attributes of the person that distinguish people from each other. And I say this non-pejoratively, but simply regards the societies, the cultures, the families, the specificities and particularities of the history of the individual as more decisive for the formulation of his or her identity. Now, when you get into the refugees debate, a lot of the discussion in the literature about refugees really is a debate between cosmopolitanism and communitarianism. So, for example, if one comes to talk about different priorities as regards solidarity and welcome, according to the communitarian view of the person, our primary obligations of solidarity are owed to those like us, like ourselves. There's a famous medieval Jewish commentator who once wrote, "The poor of your city and the poor of another city, the poor of your city come first." That was not meant to, he was not espousing selfishness, greed, prejudice, nothing of the sort. It was his way of creating a hierarchy of values that would determine his moral behavior towards others. Whereas the cosmopolitan idea of the person insists that our obligations are to all people universally. All people universally. This has a very distinguished tradition in our culture. It probably goes back all the way to Pericles' funeral oration, remember, where he says the gates of our city are thrown open to the world and we expel no foreigners. But the person, the figure who really formulated this was Kant, who in 1795 actually declared that hospitality was a universal right, ein Weltbürgerrecht, or the right of a universal citizen, of universal citizenship. And he insisted that the right of hospitality, which he had said was not a right to membership, it was a right to dwell in a place, was a matter of right, not a matter of philanthropy. And this notion that hospitality is an obligation and that refugees have to be accepted as a matter of right then has a long and very interesting history. In the 1930s, a famous jurist who won the Nobel Prize, a man called René Cassin, once actually argued for what he called the right of domicile. The right of domicile. The people simply, etc. And Jefferson, actually, I was doing some research twice. Jefferson had we were talking about this the other night. Jefferson's views on refugees and others were not glorious in their beginnings, but his thought developed, and in his first inaugural address and later again, he used the term hospitality as one of the obligations of the new country towards all the peoples of the world. So again, you see, there are two approaches here. And again, I'm not trying to provide a beautiful history for Trumpism. That's its own problem. I merely wish to point out that there is a real philosophical debate at the heart of what we're discussing here. So, for example, according to the cosmopolitan view of the person, there is a presumption of inclusion. There is a presumption of inclusion. And the burden of proof falls on those who wish to argue that we should exclude people from our borders. Whereas according to the communitarian conception of the person, there is a presumption of exclusion. That is to say, and I'll get back to this in the discussion of the nation state in a moment, that we, of course, as a sovereign people, have the sovereign right to decide who will live with us, and priority should be given to people who are most like us. This is sometimes based on a view of culture. Many people believe, I think quite rightly, that every culture has a right to develop, and to develop uninterfered with, and so on. And there is a kind of ideal of cultural people believe that homogeneity, at least in the communitarian case, that homogeneity is kind of a condition for the flourishing of culture, and that the presence of people from different cultures represents some sort of impediment or interference in the growth of the native culture. in the growth of the native culture, whereas according to the cosmopolitan view, it's quite the opposite. The cosmopolitan view recognizes that in fact cultures have all developed in relationship and in collision and in cross-fertilization with other cultures, and that the kind of homogeneity that some people recommend would actually represent the decadence of culture and the death of a culture because of the failure of it to be stimulated by foreign influences. So those, about identity, when we talk about who to accept, who to live with, why to live with them, sameness and difference, all these questions that are broached by the debate about refugees have to do with this cluster of ideas about identity. They also have a lot to do with thinking about the nation state. The idea of the nation state, developed in the late 18th, early 19th century in Europe, primarily in Germany, but not only. And the idea of the nation state was that every nation should be incarnated in a state, and every state should exemplify a nation. And basically ideally, that the political boundaries and the cultural boundaries should coincide. Now, of course, they never do coincide, and so the theory of the nation state and the nation states that were built on this theory developed this problem that became known as the problem of minorities. The problem of minorities, I'm not saying that all nation states are doomed to treat minorities unfairly or unequally. What I am saying is that minorities are problematic according to the philosophical conception of the nation state. And this kind of nationalism, which was what was the foundation of European nationalism, and by the way, was also the foundation of Zionism. Israel imported this theory of the perfect fit, as I like to call it, into its conception of nationalism. And again, in the definition of the nation, according to this conception, ideally the nation should be homogeneous or as homogeneous as it possibly can be. And it's in this culture of the nation state that one hears of natives and foreigners, or of the same and the other, in which sameness and difference become deeply, deeply problematic. Because of this, many writers and thinkers about refugees, if you study the philosophical and the historical literature on refugees, have come to a conclusion which I think is incorrect, and I'll get to in a moment, which is that what stands in the way of doing justice to refugees is the nation state. That in fact, as long as we have states that are built upon exclusivist ideas of who should live there and why, refugees will always be intrinsically problematic and fraught figures. Hannah Arendt made hay out of this. An Italian philosopher that some of you may know called Giorgio Agamben made a great deal out of this. But there is this idea that the solution to the refugee problem must somehow be found outside the nation state, because the refugee emergency represents a kind of invalidation of the nation state. This position reached its absurdity in 1949. I wrote something down to read to you. In 1949, a group of geniuses, including Einstein, Russell, George Bernard Shaw, Huxley, Mauriac, geniuses, all of them, signed a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, in which they said that the United Nations should, quote, reconsider their attitude to the refugee problem. The reason they should reconsider their attitude, these geniuses wrote, is because there are no national solutions to this problem. What they wrote was, quote, by sheer force of events, refugees have acquired the feeling of belonging to a community larger than one nation. Indeed, history made them citizens of the world, and they should be treated as such. Now here you have the acme of universalism and of this idea of world citizenship. Reading their letter, you would almost think that for the refugees, their statelessness was kind of a lucky break, right? That morally and historically, they'd been promoted to some higher state, and we had to have the wisdom to follow them, right? Now, the International Refugee Organization, which was established by the UN General Assembly in 1946, immediately shot back at this letter with a brilliant retort. I still haven't found out who wrote it. But what they wrote in this letter in return was, quote, here are people to whom you say, be proud of your statelessness, remain this way, and become the first world citizens. But stateless persons know all too well what they desire: to stop being stateless, not out of sentimentality, but to obtain asylum, a passport, a work permit, or access to a hospital. Now, this powerful reply to the idiotic idea of the geniuses, right, raises the next turn of the screw, as it were, which is to say that whatever the first 2 points, one, whatever the limitations of nation states are in the matter of the other and the same, no solution to the refugee question can be effectively found outside of the framework of nation states. Nation states are the only entities that have the power and the cohesion. They may lack the will. Welcome to Washington. But they may lack the will. But this problem can only be solved by nation states. No international organization, and certainly no fantasy of world citizenship of Weltbürgertum, right? That will not save anybody. But having said that, I think it's very important to add that the refugee crisis represents nothing less than a challenge to us, but especially to Europeans, and I'll get to this distinction in a moment, to revise their classical notion of the nation state. The theory of the perfect fit, according to which the nation should be incarnated in a state and the state should exemplify a nation, what it lacked and what Europe has always lacked, all the way back to the Albigensian massacres, was any natural understanding of and familiarity with multi-ethnicity, And so, for example, when the new Polish president or Orban or Le Pen or some of the other villains in Europe right now, when they get up and say what they do, when they utter their xenophobic or nativist sentiments, they are not betraying a European tradition. They are actually fulfilling a certain European tradition. Not the only European tradition, but what they are saying is rooted in the philosophical and cultural and political history of Europe. Whereas Trump, if you'll pardon the expression, or Cruz, whose name I think we're going to have to learn to speak a little more often, what they are doing is actually defying a philosophical consensus in this country. And it's a philosophical consensus that exists not for highbrow intellectual reasons, but because we are a country, it took a long while to get to this, and the consciousness of it didn't really kick in until the 1960s, but we are a nation state in which the nation is defined multi-ethnically, And so it seems to me that in the European case, there will be only two possible outcomes to the refugee crisis in Europe right now because of the magnitude of this exodus, because of the numbers. Either Europe will discover multi-ethnicity in some real way and either de facto or, either in actuality or intellectually revise its idea of the homogeneous nation incarnated in the state and really develop some new sense of multi-ethnicity or we will see a revival of European fascism. As far as I can see, the only two real outcomes are a new consciousness of multi-ethnicity, pluralism, or fascism. I really don't see, because the numbers of these refugees in certain countries in particular, the size of the minorities in the problem of minorities. Remember, the minority treaties after World War I and the moral working of a nation state with minorities was always premised on the idea, and Israel now is experiencing this threat, that the minority would not be so big that the majority would actually feel endangered by it. Because when the minority crosses a certain threshold, and I don't know what that threshold is, things turn ugly because the system is not philosophically or politically equipped for a multi-ethnic understanding, et cetera, et cetera. And so to conclude, I guess what I would say is this, that when we think about this problem and you look at the debate, we get caught in this old ancient dichotomy between universalism and particularism. And what I want to say to you is that I think that there is no more tiresome and obsolete dichotomy than that. There is no such thing as pure universalism. There is no such thing as pure particularism. If a pure universalist existed or a pure particularist existed, they would both be absolute human monsters. And the only avenue of access that we have to the universal is through the particular. And the reason that we must cherish the particular most is not because it's ours. That's a trivial reason. The fact that something is mine doesn't recommend it to anybody but me, right? Is not because it is ours, but because it is through the particular that we may intuit and reach to and attain the universal. And when you think about these concepts in this way, you begin to see, at least philosophically, I think, how to move towards policy thinking about the refugee crisis, though I'm perfectly aware that Kant's writings of 1795 have absolutely no bearing on what Dennis McDonough is now thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. I think we've just been treated to a unique contextualization of the refugee problem. I'm going to ask Michael to respond, and then I will come back to you, Leon, and ask you what it means for policy. But Michael, please.
Thank you. What I entirely share with Leon, although I've argued with him for 30 years and we could argue some more, what I entirely share is that this is a definitional moment about who we are, what societies are, what the United States is, what its traditions are. The refugee issue is not a humanitarian crisis. It's a definitional crisis. And I think in that sense we're on, as they say, the same page. And let's look at some of the facts. In this room, there are distinguished German policymakers who are dealing with a situation in which they had 1 million plus arrivals in 2015, and there are 2,000 to 3,000 people arriving as we speak, like right now. Secondly, there are every week people drowning in the 8-kilometer space between Turkey and Greece. And so there isn't any more fundamental encounter with our values, with our conscience, with our self-definition than children dying at sea and the banalization of children dying at sea. So it is definitional of who we are. The thing I see very clearly is that in the United States, the Syrian refugee crisis is seen fundamentally, in the first instance, as a kind of Middle Eastern problem. The world, the order of the Middle East is collapsing, and it's produced a humanitarian crisis. In Europe, the situation is seen in very different ways. It's seen as a huge inflow of persons that are challenging the boundary conditions of the nation state. I think that you've agglomerated Europe excessively. Eastern Europe, the Visegrad countries, the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, frankly, Hitler and Stalin did the genocides in those countries, and they are now essentially monoethnic. And they have, ironically, gone back to the state-nation definition that you have and won't take anybody in. They are beneficiaries of the European Union, but they don't are not prepared to accept any burden sharing. Germany, which invented all this stuff, is actually, at least in West Germany, accepted a cosmopolitan, and multicultural identity in one of the most astonishing historical transformations, one of the most heartening historical transformations the world has ever seen, in my view. If there's a hero in the story, it has been not just Chancellor Merkel, but ordinary Germans who've said, this is definitional of us. This is the time to show ourselves and the world we are different. This is the time to welcome. And the problem they are facing, and this is, I think, a policy issue relevant to Brookings, they built that post-war Germany on the Marshall Plan, on American involvement, on NATO commitments, on George Bush Sr.'s leadership in the reunification, on Dick Holbrooke's work to get the Balkans sorted. The entire German identity we're looking at post-war was built in conjunction and collaboration with the United States. And in 2015, the Germans are looking out across their parapet as 3,000 people a day are streaming in right now, and they're saying, our chief strategic ally is a bystander. Our chief strategic ally is willing to take in 2,000 people from Syria since 2011. Not 2,000 a week, not 2,000 a year, but 2,000 over 4 years. Talk about self-images of a country. This country, I'm not an American, I'm a Canadian, I'm next door, I love you guys, but your self-image is, we are the land of multicultural welcome. We are the country with a great refugee welcome record. We're the country that when UNHCR wants us to take, 65, 70,000 a year, we do. The United States has a great tradition. But over Syria, it's shut down.
And before.
And this is creating, this was the burden of the Holbrooke Forum discussions, which I'm sharing with you, is that the Europeans are looking with utter disbelief at the fracture of the transatlantic partnership that built the Europe that they grew up in. You've got a United States, the most powerful, the strongest country in the world, who's decided on the refugee issue that you simply cannot take any risk whatever. It's not merely that you can manage the risk, you can't take any risk. And a country that sends a strategic message to the world that we are so frightened that we can't remain committed to the things that make the whole world like us is a great power in serious trouble. And a country that will not support its allies as it faces the biggest challenge to their identity, to their cohesion since the Second World War, is not a serious country. I say this with affection. You can't be more pro-American than I am. But if you hear anger here, there is anger. And I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of the Holbrooke Forum. In this room, there are 25 people who will take a different view. Some will take me outside afterward and say, you went way too far. I don't give a damn. I got one time to be in public with you, and I see what the Germans are doing, and they're looking at the United States. There is nothing going on in the Syrian peace talks. It's as if the United States won't actually take ownership of that. The Russians are marching on Aleppo. They encircle Aleppo. You like the starvation in the other towns, you'll love the starvation in Aleppo because it's a big place. So the Russians are changing are actively creating refugees every single day. Mr. Kerry and Mr. Lavrov are in these pleasant discussions. The United States used to be able to understand that if you want to get a diplomatic solution, you've got to wield some force here to change the dynamics that force people to settle. At the moment, we're looking at a situation in which Assad thinks he's going to win and Putin thinks he's going to win, and the people who will pay the price were not in this room. They're the people in Aleppo and everywhere else. And the other secondary people who will pay the price will be the Germans and the Italians to a lesser degree. And this is where we are. Now, I think there are things that we can do. I think there are solutions. I think the United States has been asked by the UNHCR to take 65,000 refugees. It's a big number. I know you're all saying, oh, I can't do that. But that's what big countries do. That's what great countries do. They say, okay, let's find a way to stand up in front of the world and say, we are not going to have refugee policy in the United States dictated by IS, actually. That's not what great countries do. We're going to stand up and we're going to take leadership here. If the Germans can do it, we can do it. Secondly, we're going to deal as a great country with another scandal in this story, which is that UNHCR is about 50% funded and WFP, the World Food Program, is about 40% funded. You ask why there's a refugee flow last summer? Because they cut the food ration in every single camp. Now that's fixable. Big countries can fix things like that. Those are two things immediately in policy terms that the United States can do, and can do it actually now. Sorry, I'm steamed about this.
Okay, Leon.
Michael reminds me of in hearing what my beloved friend says, I'm reminded of a joke from Prague during the communist period about a man walking down the street, and he sees in the alley over there's another man, and he's vomiting his guts out. And he walks over to the man, puts his arms around his shoulder, and says, "I share your analysis." Look, I've said for a long time, I couldn't agree with you more. People talk about David Cameron presiding over Little England. I've said for a long time that Barack Obama is presiding over Little America. That's what we've become in the world. I am one of the many reasons, and we'll get to what could be done in a minute, why American policy is such a scandal, because American policy, or the lack of American policy, is one of the reasons that this refugee population even exists in the first place. We did absolutely nothing. Rather, we did only things that wouldn't have an effect. In the old choice between action and inaction, this White House has pioneered a third alternative, which is inconsequential action. So they will only do something as long as it doesn't decisively affect an outcome. We'll send 50 troops, we'll send 5 troops, we'll send meals ready to eat, we'll send rusted Humvees, but nothing that might have an impact on the outcome. I think that the larger problem that you described is you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, Germany, we are lagging morally behind Germany. This country is right now, which is not a sentence that I ever expected to utter, I have to say. There was a time, actually a few years ago, when the French went into Mali, when I thought we were lagging morally behind France, which is another sentence I thought I'd never get to utter. But I think you're absolutely right. I think there is some, people. I think it was Roger asked Samantha this morning. Samantha Power was here.
Well, that was off the.
Oh, sorry. She said what she said, and you can't know what it is. It's anything you think. Look, I think 65,000 is a large number only because the White House has capitulated to political realities, not because they're harsh, but because the capitulation to political realities serves their purpose of non-intervention. In other words, the poll numbers we always hear are bad on this question. The poll numbers on Obamacare were terrible before the president went out and decided to sell Obamacare. They were terrible. They were terrible. But the White House always cites bad poll numbers and war weariness and so on because they have other reasons which have to do with their views of the role of the United States in the world, with the nature of foreign policy after Iraq, with the impact of the projection of American power abroad historically, with the question of whether the United States has any moral right whatsoever to be in any way directly or indirectly responsible for an outcome in another country. But they have their, what do the economists call them? They have their priors about foreign policy. And so they can hide behind these bad poll numbers. Usually, what we're talking about is an absence, and it's the tritest term in the world, but we're talking about a complete abdication of leadership, given the suffering, the magnitude of the suffering in Syria and of the refugees, given the historic role of the United States in helping, by not acting, to bring this about. Given the fact that the American people, even in this insane moment, are not a bad people and do not like to see beheadings and do not like to see children's bodies washed up on a beach and are affected by moral considerations and do have resources of empathy to which they're prepared to consecrate their material resources, there is what to work with in this country. There is what to work with in this country. This is not Trump's and Cruz's country.
But you've got 30 governors who don't want to take,
Then
they don't even
every-
have the power to stop
Then,
it.
you
but
know
they-
what? Then every morning of every day, the president and Schumer and Reid and the other governors and archbishops and rabbis and mullahs and ex-presidents from both parties and every celebrity who ever won an Academy Award and Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and everyone else, every day of every morning should get up and re-legitimate the idea of refugee assistance and our humanitarian obligations. This is, we are a republic of opinion. We govern ourselves by our opinion. And the quality of our self-government is determined by the quality and the content of our opinions about things.
Okay. Michael, give us...
Oh, you didn't like that?
I loved it.
No.
I loved it.
Oh, no. I'm just kidding.
So sensitive.
I know. Thank you for knowing.
Michael, give us your take on the impact of this on the transatlantic relationship.
Well, I think I've said that when I talk, I don't want to, the German policymakers in the room can speak for themselves. They don't want to be identified. I want to salute them for their leadership and their participation in the forum over 3 years. But what you get from them is very tough. What they are getting is Europe is breaking apart on this, so burden sharing among Europeans is breaking down. That is, the Eastern Europeans will not take a single refugee and will not contribute to refugee relief. Orban, the Poles, the Czechs, etc. The Greeks simply can't handle their borders, so the Germans have to deal with the consequences of that. The Italians are essentially passing them on north to the Munich train station. The Germans are desperate for European-wide solutions and are not getting solidarity within their own community. So that's an indictment of Europe, and it's a criticism of Europe, and that's not America's fault. That's just the situation. It is, in a sense, the return of the nation state, and the nation state returning as razor wire.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I mean, and everybody understands that in an atmosphere of terror, there is a return of the sovereign. I mean, it gets back to your points about nation states. The imperative demand of every country to their sovereign is make us safe, and that means control our borders. And that's a European-wide problem, and Europe will have to find solutions that are compatible with their internal open borders, will have to have an external border, namely the Mediterranean, which is secure. It's a huge problem. But again, America could help in terms of security in the Mediterranean area. Let's not forget that the ill-conceived Libyan intervention has created an extraordinary situation in which, as an American policymaker said to me last night, there's 135 miles of the Mediterranean coast in Libya, which is now in the control of IS.
Sirte is now their new capital.
So, folks, again, the sense of America as a bystander here, thinking this is a European problem. You have a national security threat on the southern frontier of the Mediterranean, which is simultaneously and at the same time a refugee exporting thing. So the idea that you can just leave the Libyan problem to Italy to manage is, in national security terms, catastrophically short-sighted. So that's another area where the United States will want to work with its allies on simply the national security piece. The other thing that came out very clearly in our discussions, I don't think this is breaking any confidences, is that Germany is desperate to get a bilateral agreement with Turkey to manage the huge flows out of Turkey. But getting that agreement with Erdogan, it would be very, very helpful to have NATO's most powerful alliance partner talking to the Turks simultaneously. There are things, in other words, that America can do to make life easier for the Germans, stabilize the borders, get an agreement with Turkey. The same follows through for Lebanon and Jordan. There is a lot that the United States needs to be doing here. I've specified some of these things. And the significant fact about this is my headline, is that the refugee crisis is not a humanitarian crisis. It is a strategic and national security challenge to the United States and to the coherence of the alliances that it has created since 1945. It's that fundamental. And somehow, in this town, that penny has not dropped.
We're going to go to the audience.
One thing, short, quickly. Just to add to what you said, the most egregious failure in some ways on the part of those who support immediate assistance to the refugees, liberals, Democrats, humanitarians, the White House, all, is their absolute cowardice in the face of the argument about security. Absolute cowardice. The President of the United States should be explaining to the American people why the refugees that we admit are not, which should be obvious, wearing bombs under their coats. That, as you said, we're going to have to manage a certain amount of risk, but compared to the magnitude of our moral obligation and so on, I mean, some of you have heard me say this before, but between 1880 and 1924, the United States admitted 4 million Italian immigrants. 4 million. We got Enrico Fermi, Joe DiMaggio, Frank Sinatra, Antonin Scalia, and Al Capone, right? Now, I don't know anybody who thinks
That wasn't a good deal.
well, no, well, around here, the deal breaker is Scalia, actually. It's just...
Okay, we've got to go to your questions now. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to take 3 questions. Please identify yourself. Please make sure you ask a question. We do not have time for speeches. And we'll take them in 3. Over here, please. And Italian, by the way.
Both Italian and German and European, for that matter. So,
welcome.
thank you, by the way, Leon. That's for you. You were hinting on the fact that we should be careful not to conflate narratives with reality. Just I made some back-of-the-envelope calculations. The U.S. is hosting about 1 refugee for every 1,200 U.S. citizens at the moment, while the UK, Italy, France, and Germany are doing that to the ratio between 1 to 200 or 1 to 400. So in terms of generosity, it's important that we become aware of what the facts are. My question for Leon there, I enjoy your analysis of what's going on in Europe, but I think there are 3 elements that I would like you to elaborate upon. One is the fact that what we have in Europe is that in Europe we have the birth of the nation state with the Peace of Westphalia, but also what we have is probably the most advanced experiment in the world to move beyond the nation state from Jean Monnet onwards. So that is a challenge, an interesting challenge, but a challenge. Second problem, we have a mismatch today in Europe between politics and policymaking. Politics still takes place at the nation-state level, but policymaking increasingly has to be supranational in Europe, and we lack a pan-European public sphere to recompose this gap between politics and policymaking. Third and final point that I would ask you, if possible, to elaborate upon, I think we have another challenge in Europe in that most of the world still functions according to realist politics, still along Hobbes lines, while within Europe, we move beyond that. We are basically enjoying the perpetual peace of Immanuel Kant. And so we struggle to recompose what we have within Europe with the world outside. Thank you.
I'd say, sorry.
We're going to take a couple of others.
Say
But never
nothing.
has Immanuel Kant got such an airing in this room.
Maybe we could get him to Brookings. What do you think?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Can you wait for the microphone? Yes. Yes, you.
Well, I'm sorry, this is not a question, but...
No. We have to have
No.
questions.
That's
That's the
it's a
rules
question.
here.
It's a
You have to
question.
ask a question.
It's
It just became a question.
It's a question.
What's the question?
Well, I just want to say for Mr. Ignatieff, I was a refugee a long time ago. I didn't go through what they went through today. I'm from Lebanon. And in 1976, we had to leave because of the war. We took a boat and all that. So I'm a little bit nervous. I don't know why, but excited, I think. Because it's not every day you get to say thank you. And Canada took us. And they were so nice. I was 14. I was, didn't speak English and all that. But we went to Canada, Kitchener, and they were so wonderful. It was just a feeling that, we're on a boat, family, there's 5 of us kids and all that, and we don't know where we're going. We're French educated because we used to be a French colony, and of course we go to English Canada.
Thank you. So,
But anyway,
so the
so I wanna
question
say
is,
thank
what's
you for
Canada
Canada.
doing? We'll get to that one.
The question is, isn't Canada wonderful?
Andrew. Please, Andrew. Say-
Got one very brief comment and one question. The comment is,
Comments
Michael,
need to be really brief.
It is. Michael, I think you spoke for all of us in the forum in your conclusion, and all power to your elbow in taking the argument forward in that way. The question I'm left with is a really difficult one. It's mainly for Leon, but you can decide. I'm all for the notion of the state as a multicultural entity. And that's what we have in many countries now. But what worries me, or one of the many things that worries me about the present crisis, is actually some of the multicultural countries, including my own, and to the extent that you can call it a multicultural country, have been very restrictive in their policy on taking refugees. And some of the countries that are built on something more of an ethnic or linguistic basis, and that actually includes Germany and some of the countries in the Middle East, have been more generous in taking refugees than we have. So there's a little bit of a problem for your thesis. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a few things to you, Adam. Quickly, I think, as Martin says, there's something of a paradox here. The real question, the interesting question, is what is the role of multiculturalism in the creation of a multi-ethnic society? Multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity are not the same things. Multiculturalism is a particular interpretation and a particular set of cultural and social policies, and that have a lot to do, by the way, with the integration and absorption of immigrants. I've often thought how different this country would be if between 1880 and 1924, when the great Italian, Jewish, Irish immigrations happened, if those people had arrived to a state that was both multicultural and a welfare state. Things would have been very, very different. So there's a lot to be said about that, but I'm glad you asked that. I have to say to my friend here that I'm going to say something heretical, especially in the light of what's happening in Europe now. I'm not one of those people who worship at the shrine of the European Union, I have to tell you. I think that one of the things I have been seeing and struck by in recent years with the various crises that have been afflicting Europe, the Greek crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the refugee crisis, is that the nation states that comprise the European Union have a way of reverting to themselves in times of crises. And they behave as autonomous nation states and in conformity with, if you pardon the expression, their national characteristics. And I know that's a terrible notion, and we have to define it, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't think Europe looks like perpetual peace, like a good cup of latte on any market square on any afternoon in times of peace. But it wasn't 20 years ago during the Bosnian crisis when Europe did not look like a region of perpetual peace. And I think that what matters most to me in terms of justice, and I'll get to something beyond justice or before justice in a moment, is not the European Union or the survival of the European Union, but the justice or injustice that is done to the refugees and to the various populations of the various states. That seems more primary to me. I mean, when my friend Tom Friedman wrote a column a week or two ago, and he'd been reluctant to come out ardently for the refugee cause, and finally he did because someone told him that the crisis is a dagger pointed at the heart of the European Union. I thought to myself, that's what gets you going? I mean, there are dead babies on the beach, et cetera. The final thing I would say, actually, is that the urgency that Michael and I are expressing and the anger and the frustration that we're expressing are entirely derived not only from the high idealism for which we're both famous, but also from a very cold-hearted kind of realism. As Michael said, this is a strategic crisis. The consequences of the Syrian refugees, they could destroy Jordan, they could destroy Lebanon, they could damage Turkey, they could damage all sorts of European societies if they're not properly absorbed and justly absorbed. American alliances are falling apart because of this. The damage just proliferates. It's the perfect storm. So even from the standpoint of the most cold-hearted Scowcroftian calculation, right? There is no reason not to act.
Scowcroft. Kissingerian.
All right. Martin prefers that we curse Kissinger. Okay. Somebody tweet that. Okay. It's just.
No, don't. Please don't do that.
But in any case, I think that both idealism and realism command us, as I said with what I began, to begin to think, not to begin, to act urgently, to commit emergency action. And the question is, as I said, are we intellectually or operationally prepared? And one of the things I keep noticing is that bad fortune and bad actors forever have the jump on us in this period. We are always playing catch up to evil, always, and et cetera, et cetera.
That you can tweet.
Yes.
Michael.
I can't better that exit line, and I'll even forswear a temptation that surges in my patriotic breast as a Canadian to give you a lecture about how wonderful we are. I just want to thank somebody who has a happy memory of their welcome to our country. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you've been treated to a very special conversation here, and I feel privileged to have had the chance to moderate it. Thank you to both of you. Stay in your seat.